Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, The Top 4 Ways Visual AI is Enabling a Safer Workplace, sponsored by Spark Cognition. My name is Barry Botino. I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health and a co host of the On the Safe Side podcast. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to share. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorses those items. If you have a question during today's recorded event, just click the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and press the send button. We'll make sure all of your questions are forwarded along to our presenters. After this presentation, you'll also be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, but I'll tell you more about that later. This webcast will be archived. If you want to view this presentation or any of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. Joining us today are John Haslinger and Eric Schulte. John is the Vice President of Visual AI Solutions at Spark Cognition. He's passionate about using AI to solve critical business problems. John shares his expertise as an advisor to manufacturing, industrial, and energy companies to help deliver improvements in safety, quality, and efficiency. Eric serves as a visual AI account executive at Spark Cognition, and he's dedicated to revolutionizing industries through the use of technology. He has held key positions in consulting, strategy, and sales in various Fortune 100 manufacturing organizations. And now, here's Eric to lead us into today's event.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Really excited to be here today and looking forward to this conversation. One of the big things I'm seeing is there's a big gap for adoption for AI technologies in manufacturing. John, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that's a little bit to be expected with the rollout of new technologies. They often do start in the consumer space and then roll into the industrial space. But with the pace of innovation in the AI space, this gap gets pretty noticeable pretty quick, where we're accustomed to AI algorithms recommending to us the next video to watch on Netflix, but yet we don't have these tools to leverage in our professional lives. But I think what's exciting to me is that we're seeing the professional applications of AI for industrial use cases coming very quickly along now. So I think very soon we'll all be using a lot more AI in our professional lives.
And that's why I'm so excited today is we're not at that early adopter stage anymore for the curve. Like, we have a number of these quite well-renowned companies that are leveraging this technology for safety applications all around the world. I think what might be helpful today is let's take the time to really kind of walk through the process. Let's go through and re-baseline what's happening with EHS programs right now. Then we can go into what technology we're talking about. Like, what is visual AI? What does that actually mean? And then my favorite part is jumping into some real world applications. What are the measurable impacts that are being had right now in facilities that have adopted the technology? And then last but not least, I'm so thankful that we have so many people joining us today, and they have that chat box. Please jump in and ask any questions that you have. We're going to make sure to have some time at the end to be able to address some of these. And if we don't get to them, we'll make sure we get back to you. But I think with that, John, let's hop right into the content. So when we look at it, and we talked about baselining, what is EHS? And, I want to address the first three pretty quickly. The first things that people think about is just basically de-risking the manufacturing environment. Are you compliant? Are you safe? And are you being environmentally responsible? And that's, frankly, it's in the name, but would love to have you talk to the other 3 points. What have you seen in manufacturing on the other impacts of a quality EHS program?
Oh, that's a very important point, Eric, because a lot of the indirect benefits of EHS programs can really be significant for a lot of companies today. The first one is productivity and efficiency. I mean, we all know how disruptive having an incident can be, the production losses, the turnover employees. of employees, et cetera, but also even indirectly. Studies have shown that when people are worried about their safety, they're not happy in the workplace, they're going to be less efficient in the jobs that they have. Additionally, reputation and trust on the corporate level. I mean, with corporate ESG reports and alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which includes several factors related to safety in the workplace and fair treatment of employees, corporate responsibility is increasingly important, not just for the altruistic benefits, but also fundamentally the company's bottom line. Certain investors are only willing to invest in companies that meet certain thresholds for compliance with various ESG standards. So ultimately, companies that have a good reputation for safety and good treatment of their workers are going to have cheaper access to capital. And then finally, it comes back to cost savings. Again, going back to a lot of the things that Eric said, everything we're going to talk about today has a cost of the company: direct cost of incidents, indirect cost of incidents, and also the costs of having low morale, low productivity, low reputation. All that ties back to cost savings for the company. And Eric has some pretty impressive numbers on the ROI that you can get from an EHS investment in terms of the 2x or more cost savings.
And let's jump into a few of those numbers, and especially with having safety professionals on the webinar, I think there's a lot that they're going to be familiar with. Numbers aside, it's extremely expensive when things go wrong, but the big thing is the emotional impact. We don't want people to get hurt in our workplaces. It's really hard to find good talent. You made a great point on the reputation and the other side. But the other part is it's happening. We have millions, which I really wish the numbers weren't so high of injuries. And then when we're looking at fatalities, the fact that we're still in the thousands is baffling. And when we look at what's this pattern been, what's been awesome is we saw this consistent fall in what's happening from a worker safety side and an injury standpoint up until about 2010. But what's been a little bit disheartening is we've seen a flat line. And John, from your experience, what do you think is really causing this? Like, we've got a bunch of industry professionals, let alone the people that are on this call, that are looking at this and focused on a day-to-day basis. But what do you think this gap is?
It's an interesting one, Eric. And I actually think this means that in general, EHS professionals are very, very good at their jobs. It means that they've become experts as a whole with the tools that they have available to them. And basically, they've reduced injuries and incidents to basically as low as they can get them with the current tools that they have in their inventory and the resources that they have available to them. And since they've gotten them down to that level, it's been stable for about a decade or more. What that really shows is that to get that next step change in EHS performance, to reduce injuries to the next lower level, we're going to need to go to a new toolkit to be able to get that next turn of the crank, because EHS professionals are experts with the tools they have today. They're optimized at that level, but they're not going to get to the next level without a new tool. And that's where I think the AI can be really exciting, to give them a new tool to help them get to that next level.
Well, and I know we're going to talk about the AI stuff in a little bit, but I think it'd be helpful. Let's walk through for a minute or two on what the current challenges really are that are causing that stagnation. And across this, I think we're going to see a common pattern, which is visibility and not having access to what's going on from a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, especially when you have each EHS person is typically responsible for 100, 300, 1,000 people inside a facility. We don't have that many eyes in our head, right? We only got two. And when we look at the reactive side, I look back to my career and when I was on the construction side of things, and we had an incident. So there was an overhead garage door, and there was a knuckle boom, and someone ended up running into it. Really unfortunate, an expensive mistake. The entire focus for the rest of summer on all of our safety stuff was vehicle safety with garage doors. What was unfortunate is we ended up having a number of safety incidents that weren't related to that, because that wasn't actually a core problem. It was an isolated incident, But since we didn't have access to the data on what was going on with other, near miss or unsafe behavior, we couldn't really focus in. So as soon as a problem happened, we focused on that for a while. And then as soon as a new issue happened, we focused on that. And it's this lagging measure that we keep going along. But, the other part is, I'd love to hear your thoughts when we start looking at, the human being aspect and that limited subject. What's your experience in the manufacturing environment?
That's a great point, Eric. And this is something where human beings by nature, we're forgetful. Even the best trained, most qualified, most experienced employee is going to occasionally forget a step, slip up. Yes, in some cases for critical steps, you can have a second person double check a step, but that sort of do check can be very, very expensive. And let's be honest, is cost prohibitive in many cases. In addition to the forgetfulness of people, new staff can be unaware of those procedures, those processes. And we'll be honest, in a lot of industries, dealing with contractors, short service employees is a reality of the business. You don't have the benefit of 20-year employees across the board that are well trained and well experienced. And let me share from my experience, even when you have someone that is very, very experienced, certified, it's human nature to forget things. I'll tell you, for example, I locked my keys in the car the other day because I forgot to put them in my pocket. And if we put that in a EHS context, well, was I trained for the task? Yes, I'm trained to drive. Am I experienced? Yes, I've been driving for more than a decade. So by the classic EHS metrics and corporate training metrics, yes, I'm trained, I'm certified for the task, and I do it regularly, but I still forgot. And I still slipped up, didn't follow the procedure, had an incident. I mean, fortunately, locking my keys in the car is not a injury or anything like that. It just causes me some embarrassment and some wasted time getting the keys out. But you can see how the same thing can happen in an industrial site, even when people are very familiar with tasks, they're very experienced, they're trained in the procedures, they can still forget, and a mishap can happen with even higher consequences than those I experienced.
I'm really glad that you bring up the point on the experienced staff, because the other side, I've frankly been a victim of being the new guy. I was so excited in my first field sales role going out into manufacturing plants. And I went out to a food and beverage facility. I didn't realize with the short hair that I have that I still needed a hairnet. 25 minutes into walking the floor, I finally had a supervisor that said, "Hey, you need to do that." I was so embarrassed, but I didn't know. And so you kind of have both of those sides. You have that drift of behavior and experienced employees, and then you have the new people in a facility that just don't know better. And that's completely fine. They don't mean badly by it, but you've got to be able to help them out. And just having one person or two people walking around with that responsibility, it's a challenge, right? And when we look at that too, on having a couple people, reporting or identifying issues, let's go to the paperwork. The experience that I had is even the most advanced organizations still had computer paperwork that they needed to fill out for a near miss or an unsafe behavior. And people are generally understaffed, they're busy, and they've got their personal lives. So if nothing goes wrong, it's kind of hard to tell me to hop off the line for 15, maybe it's even 10 minutes to go type up paperwork. But that data is really important. Like, are you seeing the same thing when you're in facilities?
From my experience working in sites, it's very hard for this reporting data to be representative because of all the biases that you mentioned, Eric. Reporting is manual in every case. Even in the best case, like you said, with the digital EHS reporting system, someone's got to go to a terminal, get to a device, type up the report. In other cases, someone's got to manually write down something on a stop card and turn it in. It has to be typed up. It all takes time. And also the risks and hazards that people are going to report are only going to be the ones that they observe. And there's something that occurs where people that are exposed to a risk day in, day out can actually become accustomed to it. I worked for a while in a yard where we loaded and unloaded trucks. And I got way too comfortable being next to speeding vehicles, where I would be a foot or two away from a truck going 20, 30 miles an hour next to me. Was that compliant to our corporate procedure? No, absolutely not. The speed limit, I think, was 8 miles an hour, and I was supposed to be 3 feet away from them. The reality was I'd been exposed to that risk so many times, just like all my coworkers had in the yard. and luckily no one had been hit by a vehicle, we became accustomed to that risk. It became normalized. And with all honesty, if you asked us to think about the risks we were exposed to on a day-to-day basis, that wouldn't have come up. So really, these reporting systems, when you have people manually reporting near-miss unsafe acts, are not going to be statistically representative, even when there's very strong reporting cultures. Even I've worked in companies where we've had to report a certain number of reports per day. Thinking back on that, I probably wrote the same 5 stop cards in different variations every day of the week. And it ultimately, the system wasn't representative of the risks that the site faced there.
And when we look at that, I mean, this is not going to be unfamiliar to any of the safety professionals on the call. But one of the big things on the visibility side is, as much as it's hard to see the unsafe behavior or near miss where, frankly, nothing bad is happening, it's just that statistical relationship between those behaviors and then the things that we really don't want to happen, of someone not going home the same way that they came to work, whether that's an injury or a fatality. We really don't want to see that. But as we mentioned earlier, it's the status in America, right? We've got over 3 million injuries a year and more than 5,000 fatalities. We've got to have that visibility in the bottom chunk to really be able to have a meaningful impact when you go up. And we talked about AI for a little bit earlier, but I'd love to have you talk a little bit more on what is the technology actually doing from a visual AI side, and what is visual AI? Because a lot of times we're just hearing AI and we think of chat GBT or other things, but if you want to jump into that, that would be super helpful.
Sure. And let me talk a little bit about what that technology can do, and specifically what computer vision can do to help give you that visibility and help address EHS concerns. So what is computer vision? Computer vision is a technology that extracts insights from unstructured video data. Personally, I think that one of the larger sources of underutilized data we have today is video footage. I mean, I worked in plants for over a decade, and I think every single one of them had cameras, but let's be honest, no one had time to watch that footage. So all the insights of near misses or hazards in that footage was lost every 30 days as those videotapes got overwritten. Occasionally, yes, they'd be manually reviewed if there was an incident, but that was only a small subset of the data, and it took a lot of time to do that manual review. When you apply computer vision to a single image or a single frame, you can start to classify and detect things like trucks, people, PPE, et cetera. So, you can address some of the basic use cases like Eric not wearing his hairnet, or someone parking their vehicle the wrong way or in the wrong spot. But when it's applied to video, that's when things get really interesting, because you're able to apply the temporal analysis, and the insights that get extracted can go beyond just the simple questions on, PPE compliance, et cetera, to safety compliance of much more complex scenes, like line of fire of operating equipment, or if a vehicle is passing too quickly or too close to pedestrians in a warehouse, and really get a much more complete picture of more advanced risks and also more complex procedural compliance questions.
That's a really good point on how kind of the technology works and some of the areas that people are leveraging. But I think what might be helpful is, let's take it back one step. What's a few areas, and hint, we did name it the four ways that we're impacting safety. But how is this actually having a meaningful impact on manufacturing environments today? And are there a couple simple ways that we can talk about to just really focus in on how we could help folks?
No, that's a great point. There are 4 ways we can break this down to. And the first one is active monitoring. And that's the continuous vigilance in your environment, so you can detect comprehensively the unsafe acts, the unsafe conditions, the near misses that are occurring in your site. Going back to your example, Eric, of the vehicle knuckle boom crane incident. As you said, that was an isolated incident, but without a technology like visual AI to confirm that, there was no way for management to know if that was an isolated incident or not. Therefore, they fell into the trap of being overly reactive. And this way, with active monitoring, you can very quickly answer the questions of, for example, is this an isolated incident? How often does this happen? For example, how many times when you've been doing an investigation have you had to go back and go through the 5 whys or an investigation tree and say, well, is this systematic? Was this a one-off? What other hazardous behaviors have been happening around here? And that's where the AI can really help you quickly answer those questions by having analyzed all your historical data already to look at that and save you time in the investigation.
I feel like the question comes up a lot of times, especially when you have serious injuries or, God forsake, for fatality, of how often is this behavior happening? Are we at risk of this happening again? Is it an isolated incident? And I guess, what do you think it would mean for EHS professionals to be able to, in a couple clicks, go to a dashboard and be able to say, you know what, this isn't a problem, or it is, but it's only at 3 of 5 facilities, or X of Y. I mean, what do you think that would mean for folks these days?
Well, that allows them to get not only much more efficient with their time. So again, you can get an answer in a couple of clicks instead of either having to do a whole bunch of interviews, which, let's be honest, how honest are the answers that you get when you ask someone how often they conduct a hazardous behavior or do something they shouldn't do, or manually review hours and hours of footage, which is going to take you days and days probably to do. So it's a huge time savings there. And it also allows you to be very targeted with your application of resources. Like, for example, Eric, as you said, if the hazard is really only isolated to one specific site or one shift, then you invest in training and targeting that specific shift, that specific site, or mitigating the hazard another way. And you can be much more efficient with the limited EHS investment dollars that you have, because we all know that everyone's working with the budgets that they have. And taking that active monitoring the next step and tying it into real-time alerting, you can actually go the next step and address some of these hazards before a incident actually may even occur. And I'll show you an example of this in a little bit, but if someone, say for example, someone leaves a cart across a walkway, creating a potential trip hazard, and a lot of sites, falls from the same height, slips, trips, and falls are typically one of the top 5 causes of injuries. So it's a common hazard to have someone put a trip hazard in a walkway. What if instead of waiting for someone to manually report that, someone to notice it, move it out of the way, the AI sees that through the active monitoring and then in real time is able to push out a notification to someone, either on a mobile device or an IoT device, a PA system, a light, so they can come and then address the hazard, reducing the risk, potentially preventing an incident from happening. And that's a way that you can actually get ahead of the injury or the incident by the AI identifying the hazard, notifying someone in real time, and allowing them to take action. Another example of this is I used to work in a site that had gantry cranes with flashing lights on them. Probably by the 3rd day I was working there, I basically ignored the flashing light because the cranes were running all the time. Most of the time they weren't over my head, but it also meant that when they were over my head, I completely ignored them. And this is human behavior. This is human nature. This happened to everyone at the site. But with a technology like visual AI, you can monitor if someone's under a suspended load and then set off a targeted alert at that time. And I can tell you if there was an additional buzzer or strobe that went off when I was actually under the suspended load, I would have looked up, noticed, got out of the way, and then again, eliminated that hazard and prevented a potential incident from happening. The next way that you can actually leverage AI is to predict workplace incidents. If you've got visibility and representative visibility into the base of your HSE pyramid, then you can predict what types of serious incidents you're going to have. And when you're comprehensively capturing the base of that pyramid with your AI, you can predict where and what type of incidents you're going to have. So, instead of being reactive to incidents that fortunately in most sites don't happen that frequently, you can see, oh wait, we've got an increase in hazardous behavior around forklift driving. Let's launch a safety campaign to address that before you actually have an incident, because you're able to predict, oh, this site, increase in forklift risk, let's target that. And then you can actually take actions before that happens and bring that risk back down. And then the fourth piece is to measure the effectiveness of your controls, especially behavioral controls. In that example I was just talking about where you roll out a forklift training in a site to address some hazardous behavior. Well, then you can use the AI to measure the change in hazardous behavior around forklift driving. And hey, if you see a 60% reduction after the training, great. That's a great training program, really impactful, And that's something that you should definitely consider rolling out to other sites that you want to target for elevated forklift risks. Inversely, if you don't see a reduction in hazardous behavior after investing in a control, a training program, etc., you can quickly quantify that that wasn't the right place to spend your money, and then go back and figure out how to address that a different way. And that's something historically we haven't had with a lot of our EHS control programs. I mean, after you do a training, sure, you can collect feedback, you can collect surveys. And I mean, people always generally are positive about that. But here you can get quantifiable value and measure that. And we'll talk more about quantifying value in a little bit, but as a little bit of a preview, if you know that the cost of forklift incidents for us at this plant is, on average $1 million when it happens every other year. So on average, we have a $500,000 exposure to forklift incidents. And if you're able to say, well, I reduced that by 60% by investing in this training, then you can quantify how much you've saved, how many $100,000 you've saved by reducing that $500,000 by 60%. So then you're able to quantify the ROI on that EHS investment to your upper management.
No, and that's such a good point. And what I'm so excited about with this technology is you're able to get objective measures to be able to track and uncover insights. Where are my problems really? So that way you're focusing your efforts. You can analyze that to say, you know what, like you mentioned, is it a training? Is it, adding a guarding, apparatus to something? What's going on? You can update that. But the biggest thing is that you can measure the impact. And there's two sides of that. One, from an EHS professional side, it's awesome to be able to say, this is the meaningful impact that I had on the business. And the other part, especially with the unsafe and near miss behavior, here's where we were at. And I loved your term on exposure, because especially when you're looking at insurance and liability, it's how can we decrease the possibility that this is going to happen again? And you've got to have those objective measures to be able to see that. And then the best part is after you go through this cycle, you then have an ongoing objective 24/7 thing that can look at it to say, am I keeping up with the positive behavior that we instituted? So that way you have an ongoing scorecard so you can focus on the next challenge area instead of needing to, kind of play goalkeeper on what you've done so far. I mean, all of this sounds amazing, but John, what's really holding people back? Like, what are the challenges to be able to adopt a technology like this?
I think the challenges with any new technology are not going to be too dissimilar, but let me talk about 4 that are specific to this type of computer vision system and give you some ideas of some questions that you should talk to people about when you're investigating these technologies. I mean, if you're evaluating a vendor, you should ask them these questions and see how they respond and see if that's going to be a good fit for you. The first one is integrations. Basically, how does their system integrate with your existing systems? If you have an existing digital EHS reporting platform, you don't want to have your reports in 2 different systems. You want everything pushed to the existing pane of glass that people are used to working in, be it a business system or corporate reporting platform. And can you do this with your computer vision technology provider? Also, how does it integrate with your existing infrastructure that's in the plants? If you've got cameras, if you've got other devices and sensors in the plants, how is it potentially going to integrate with that equipment there? You don't want to have to rip and replace a whole bunch of expensive equipment that you may have already invested in. The next challenge is onboarding. How much of a burden is it going to be on your staff to train, to learn, to use this equipment? Do you have to have data scientists to manage this? Do you have to set up every single specific hazard yourself? Or is this something that the vendor is going to take care of you and basically you just get benefit from the insights of the solution? The third one is compatibility. And again, this kind of ties back into the integrations, but is this solution going to lock you into a specific vendor of cameras or a specific type of hardware? Or is it broadly compatible with a whole range of hardware, and it's going to allow you to have flexibility as you go forward? And the fourth one is security and privacy. First of all, is the data secure? Is it being processed on your site? Is it being streamed off your site onto another site that's outside of your control. And then also with video data, which can potentially contain people's faces, other personal information, how much of that is being actually captured and recorded? And is there any anonymization being done to that? A lot of us have no blame EHS cultures. And so we want to support that with any sort of visual AI or computer vision reporting solution. So, you should ask your vendor, do they support anonymization in their solution? So you can blur people's faces from reports and
Yeah, and honestly, that's a great list of areas. And I'm sure there's going to be a few other, especially as we get into use cases, on kind of key questions you should ask vendors. And I would challenge the audience on kind of anything that you guys are worried about in this space. Ask us. Like, there aren't challenges that we haven't heard. We'd love to be able to talk through it. The next thing outside of talking about the challenges is, okay, we've talked about a cool technology. We've talked about what's going on with EHS. But what areas are people tangibly focusing on to be able to have impact? Because there's so many areas that you could try to direct attention. What have you seen in your experience, John?
There's a wide variety of applications for a technology like this. And it's frankly impossible to cover them all in a 1-hour webinar. But I want to highlight here a couple of places that many companies are starting and finding quick success, because that's something else that's you want to focus on with a project like this is, what can I do quickly and within 6 months have a solution up and running and showing me value around a specific area? And these are some ideas of those areas. The first one can be is fire and smoke detection and fire and smoke safety. So not only just actually detecting fire and smoke, early signs of that, but also safety around activities that can generate fire and smoke. AI powered fire watch for hot work, checking to make sure fire control measures, fire safety equipment is in place, etc. The next area is worker monitoring, worker safety, especially for hazardous work. So it can be everything from monitoring lone workers, monitoring a person down or a person in distress and getting them help quickly, which we all know will lead to a better outcome, or things like restricted space entry, confined space entry. I mean, one of the key tenets of confined space work is logging people in and out and often only entering there under permit or appropriate controls. And the AI can act as a second set of eyes to help you maintain that log. The next area that can come up is PPE compliance. And that can be not just general plant-specific PPE, boots, hard hat, et cetera, but also if there's task-specific PPE. For example, if someone's going into a blasting area, do they have the correct apron, face shield, respirator on? Or if someone's going into a hazardous chemical, or handle a hazardous chemical, do they have the appropriate long gloves on? Also, for those sorts of areas, if there are only authorized people that are allowed to be in there, are those the authorized people that are actually going in those spaces? And if it's only supposed to be entered, for example, under a permit, the AI can help notify if entry is someone tries to enter the space not under a permit. The fourth area is one that I kind of touched on earlier, is that yard management use case where you've got vehicles and people in the same space together. Vehicle pedestrian near miss. It's a very, very common use case. We all know those are very high impact events whenever they happen, whether it's a forklift, a truck, etc. Vehicle speed, general traffic rule compliance. Again, vehicle incidents always tend to be high impact. They're high energy, so it's high severity. So this is an area where a lot of companies can see a lot of benefit really quickly. And the fifth area is some of the more task-specific safety, things like red zone management. Are people in line of fire of equipment that's operating? Are people under suspended loads? Does someone have the appropriate work authorization for the tasks they're completing? And this is something where I gave the example earlier of not only monitoring and providing feedback on when someone's exposed to risk, but in areas where you're trying to manage a risk to as low as reasonably achievable. That, for example, yes, people are going to be in these hazardous zones to complete key tasks, and you want to minimize it. The AI can also be used to monitor that and give you an idea of your exposure over time. So it's not just giving you an alert, this is up, someone entered this area, but also how are we doing? Are we really doing our best to monitor our exposure? in these areas. If someone's working near high pressure or has to work in an area near a radioactive source, are they minimizing their exposure in those areas? And are we really doing our best around that ALARA principle?
I really appreciate that. But, selfishly, I would say that all these areas sound great. But one of the challenges that I've heard in the market is, okay, that's cool, theoretically. What organizations, especially well-known ones, are using it? Where are they using it? And what are the meaningful impacts that it's having on them? And, to give a little bit of a spoiler, maybe we can talk about Oreos first.
Sure. Let me give you a couple of for instances. And this one is actually from Mondelez, where they're using visual AI to proactively monitor their camera feeds, identify risks, send alerts with the real-time notifications that we talked about earlier, and then they can immediately take feedback or corrective action, ultimately reducing incident rates. And what's interesting here as well is they've actually combined use cases from both health and safety, but also productivity in their solution. And going back to talking about questions you should ask a potential vendor or provider of a solution like this is looking beyond the EHS applications, what other types of computer vision applications do they offer you? Because when you're talking to your plant managers, your operations managers, your stakeholders, I'm sure they all like EHS, but if you can build them a business case that says, yes, you can do EHS, but also you can get productivity insights, you can get security insights, et cetera, from the same solution, you may be able to build a much more compelling business case. And that's in fact what Mondelez did here.
And on that, when we look at an application, can one, say, camera feed or data source be used for a lot? Or are you telling me that I need, 3 cameras for every aisle to be able to look at, safety, productivity, and other things? Or is it really something that you can have a blanket impact of one technology on multiple areas of the business?
Great question, Eric. And honestly, the answer to that it varies between different vendors. Some vendors are very focused on one specific area. And then, yes, you would need, 3, 4 parallel technologies to give you all the answers you want. Others have a broad scope of use cases. And essentially from one camera, one solution, you can get all those insights that you want. So that's why I highlight it's so important to ask those questions. What we're doing here for Mondelez is we're doing the safety use case around the forklift, where in addition to monitoring pallet stacking PPE, we're also monitoring dynamically an exclusion zone around this forklift. And what you can see here is that, as the forklift is driving straight, a lower risk activity, it's not alerting, but once it starts turning, raising the load with someone that's too close to the forklift within that exclusion zone, the AI notices that because it's dynamically monitoring that and generates an alert. So that then Mondelez can get an idea of what's their exposure to people being too close to forklifts and also where it's happening. So again, they can target that investment. But also you can see here the AI is tracking pallets, it's tracking the actual vehicles. So they get very granular analytics on vehicle utilization, pallet movements, how many vehicle hours, how many man hours are going into each specific activity that they're doing in their plant. So they get a lot of insights both on the EHS side, but also on the productivity side from the single visual AI advisor solution here.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And then the other question I have, so when we're looking at something like this is great on safety and productivity, but a lot of times, right, we have standard operating procedures that we need to enforce. Is it capable? Are there people using it to be able to look at patterns of behavior that need to be followed?
Yes, absolutely. And procedural adherence is one of the key areas where you can really build this virtuous cycle that you were highlighting earlier, Eric. And one of our customers, a major oil and gas company, HPCL, overall said they saw an 80% improvement in adherence to standard operating procedures across their organization after the deployment of Visual AI Advisor, which to me is huge because that means that essentially they've reduced their risk related to procedural adherence issues by 80%, which is an absolute massive savings. I mean, it's everything from monitoring if people are getting too close to moving equipment, like you can see here with this metal rolling machine, to this bottom case here where someone's jumping up actually on this plasma cutter. And the plasma cutter example I like to highlight because a piece of equipment like this is hard to protect with an engineered control. You can't put hard guarding all the way around a plasma cutter. You got to load and unload work from it. You can't, so it's impossible to fence the whole thing off. And normally you have to rely on workers basically knowing to stay away from a running plasma cutter. Well, the AI can act as a second set of eyes there. And if someone jumps up on the plasma cutter, obviously it sees that. It can identify that as a hazard, let you know that's happening. But also in this case, it can integrate with the equipment. So if someone does jump up onto the table while the plasma cutter is running, it can send in a signal to the field bus that controls the equipment to actually stop it, kick it into maintenance mode, so that even though the person didn't follow the proper lockout tagout procedures before climbing onto the table of the plasma cutter, the AI was able to step in and keep them from getting hurt.
And that's a really cool one. And I would kind of challenge the audience that might be looking at an application where they're having challenges, whether it's really cost prohibitive to guard something, or they're looking at something that is just impractical to do that. And we can talk about it and see. I think there's a few different avenues that we can work with people where you can leverage that as an additional control to protect your employees. That stuff is kind of a lot of the exciting, a bit more heavy industry side. Would love to, do you have any examples that you can think of, John, where we're looking at kind of the simpler ones like slips, trips, and falls? I think OSHA still ranks that one pretty high, and as much as it might not be as scary, it's pretty impactful inside of the manufacturing environment.
Absolutely, and that's something where for example, for a CPG deployment in a manufacturing food manufacturing plant, where the solution can help people reduce slips, trips, and falls. What you have here is actually someone's put a cart here in the walkway. This blue cart in the bottom left is actually in a marked designated pedestrian walkway, and there's 5 people nearby it. They're standing there completely ignoring it. I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about normalized risk. Clearly, no one sees that as a hazard. Otherwise, they do something about that. So they're not taking action there, and ultimately, someone's probably going to trip over that cart because it's there in the walkway. What the AI can do here is send a notification to a supervisor that this hazard exists, who then can go out and assign someone to actually address the hazard, move the cart out of the way. And in this vein, Dufil actually saw a 50% reduction in unsafe acts when they rolled out the system to their frontline supervisors. So what they did is they deployed the system on the site, but they didn't give their frontline managers access to the dashboard to see what types of unsafe conditions, unsafe acts they were encountering from the get-go. They actually monitored things for about 2 weeks to establish a baseline of their behavior. And they saw on average, they had about 100 violations around some of their key processes a day. And then when they rolled out the dashboard to their frontline supervisors, so the supervisors could see quickly where they had procedural noncompliances, within a matter of days, they had over a 50% reduction in unsafe acts, and it stayed low. So, it's just giving the supervisors, who unfortunately can't be everywhere watching everything all the time, as Eric said previously, insights on where to spend their time, where to focus, where to, what to bring up in the pre-shift safety meetings, where to spend your time with auditing and supervision. They can have a real meaningful impact in reducing critical safety exposures, especially around procedural controls.
That's really good to hear. And, when we're looking at this, it starts to seem like a no-brainer. You've got a lot of these major international organizations that are adopting and seeing good results from this technology. And I think we got to talk a little bit about the business case side. Because, you mentioned it earlier accurately, John, like where everyone's operating within a limited budget. And absolutely, when there's an incident, typically that budget gets a lot larger. But how do you look at it from a proactive side? When you're like, hey, you know what? I want to improve the status quo of my facility, but I'm not quite sure how I could justify the funding to a CFO or to a procurement organization. And, that's what we're starting to see, right? It's how do you create that measurable ROI? And you know what? We mentioned some of the statistics, and obviously we'll send out the slides so you can look at some of the things on what injuries are. And I'm sure organizations know internally what it actually costs them. But then we start to look at, and that's where I love to be able to jump in with the use cases and case studies we've done with organizations is, what are the other knock-on effects? Great, you have less issues on safety, but now suddenly your throughput's higher because you don't have a line down because you have people that are stepping out to be able to do admin meetings, or you don't have equipment down because someone got, tangled up with something, and how do we look at those improvements? And that's where, I'd look at, we have some additional statistics, I think, on this next one that we can start to look at that has been really exciting. For the longest time, I feel like it's been a very reactive measure to invest in EHS. And what we're starting to see is kind of a global adoption from a CFO and finance side that they're noticing. And given it's more than half now, it's not everyone, but more than half are seeing that there's meaningful results for every dollar invested in EHS. And we really want to help people with those business cases. So same thing in the questions, or if you want to reach out directly, we want to help people on being able to tie that business impact to that investment, because we all have the same goal. We want people to go home in the same condition that they went to work, right? And I think, John, you might have mentioned that is there a tool you've been working on to try to help folks out with this?
Well, yes, and a lot of I'm sure, have your own data on company-specific injury costs, injury rates, incident types, et cetera. And whenever you have specific data like that for your own business case, that's going to be the most impactful thing to use. But not everyone has that type of data. And if you don't have that type of data, we built a generic calculator that uses Bureau of Labor Statistics data on injury rates, injury costs, that lets you run some scenarios on what your ROI would be for investing in various EHS systems. So you're able to calculate to say, well, if we're reducing our hazards by this much, this is the type of savings that we should expect to see. So then you can get a quick sense of, is this going to be an ROI that my management's going to get excited about or not?
Well, and to kind of wrap it up before we take some questions, which I'm really excited to see what comes out of the audience, is what did we talk about today? We went through quite a bit, from the baseline of what's going on with EHS, what those challenges are, what this computer vision AI stuff is, and even what meaningful impacts it's having. But if we really want to wrap it up, first, there's a large direct cost in both the US and global markets for injuries and fatalities around manufacturing. It's unfortunate, but it's real. We've seen a stagnation of impact, and we need to be able to give those EHS professionals additional tools to be able to influence and decrease that more. When we look at visual AI, we look at it of decreasing the burden and increasing the accuracy of information, especially to that bottom of Bird's pyramid on unsafe acts and near misses. And when we go on number 3, right, it's like, what were those 4 things that we really looked at impacting? You're going to have active monitoring of what's going on in facility 24/7. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't need a nap. Believe it or not, it doesn't need coffee. And then we look at that of, okay, you have data of everything. You can have real-time alerts, so that way you can nip challenges right in the bud, right when they're happening. You can predict where your big focus areas are. And that last thing is, especially as a professional, you get to have a measurable impact on what you did. Did it work? Did it not? So that way you're not spending a bunch of effort on ineffective programs. And when you do a killer job on your job, you can be able to go back to management and say, hey, you know what? And you brought it up a few times, right? With HPCL, 80% reduction in issues. But those are meaningful impacts for the organization, right? And it's just, when we go into those last couple of points, it's visual AI is giving you that objective, accurate data. And so that last point is, you can understand the ROI, not only of the visual AI platform, but frankly of what you're doing as an individual and how you're influencing the organization, which I mean, to me, that helps me get out of bed in the morning, right? Like, it's, that when you get up, you made the organization safer by X amount, and that's cool. And with that, let's kick it off and let's go over and maybe take some questions from the audience today. So looking at the list of questions we got here, I know we've got a number of them. There's going to be a handful that we're not going to be able to get to today. So if you are one of those folks with a question, don't worry. We have them recorded. We're going to reach out and follow up with those answers there, but we'll try to get to a bulk of them. Starting off here, John, one of the questions that popped up, what other systems can benefit from integration with this kind of computer vision AI technology?
The systems that get integrated do vary a little bit depending on the site, the operations, and the workflow. But on a high level, definitely EHS reporting systems are, I would say, probably one of the most common ones on the EHS side that get integrated. But also things like general corporate ERPs, especially when you start looking at things like productivity data, get integrated many times. So you just get insights on what's happening on your sites. Additionally, I showed you examples of integrating with field bus equipment or plant equipment. We can also integrate with notification equipment on sites, be it strobes, be it sirens. Also even with PA systems in many cases. For example, very common in security applications, if someone jumps a fence and accesses your site after hours, for a PA system to be set up to play a message to them that they've been spotted and ask them to leave the site. So those are a small list of the types of systems that integrate with visual AI and benefit from that. But the list does continue, and if you have a specific use case, encourage you to reach out and ask about that type of integration, because there are a number that I can't cover today.
And then kind of tied into that question, could you give an example of a computer vision AI system working with a reporting or record system? I know you brought up EHS reporting systems. Maybe dive into that of how it integrates, and then people can extrapolate a little bit on how that might integrate with, a productivity or quality system as well.
We work with a number of customers and different systems, but one that I can publicly speak about is our integration with Benchmark ESG, where our systems integrate out of the box, and whenever a EHS concern is noted by the AI system, it automatically populates a concern report in the Benchmark system, again, for follow-up closure as per sort of the normal reporting workflow.
All right, we got a couple more coming through the line. How does visual AI affect employee behavior, especially around safety?
Just having the system doesn't actually alter anyone's behavior. I mean, I showed you that example where everyone knew the system was being deployed, but you saw they were having, basically 100 unsafe acts per day. But once it was tied into that feedback loop, that's when you see those step changes in behavior. We shared numbers, 80%, 50%, 60% improvement in behavior. So the system, when combined with engagement and feedback from supervisors, can give you basically 50 to 80% improvement in a lot of your procedural adherence concern areas when you deploy a solution. But the system alone isn't going to do anything. You have to close the loop with humans, as I think most of you expect with any sort of EHS program.
Yeah, this has been a big one across all the clients I've talked to is, if I'm going to adopt this, what skills, what expertise do folks need? And what's that time requirement to be able to really, support a visual AI system inside a facility?
For Spark Cognition solution, if you can use a computer, use Word, use PowerPoint, use Excel, you can use this solution. I mean, it's all designed to be run from a graphical user interface, point and click, drag and drop. So you don't need advanced data science skills. As you talk to companies in this space, you want to evaluate how much effort is this going to take from my team. Personally, I know that Spark Cognition takes the approach of basically setting the system up for you, making sure it's configured up and running in a relatively short period, typically about 8 weeks. So you're seeing value very quickly, and you don't have to have a dedicated employee that goes through and spends weeks and weeks and weeks configuring everything for you to see value about it. And again, assuming that the cameras are in place, the connectivity's in place, et cetera, it's not unreasonable to say, yeah, we're going to be up and running within a quarter. And, then we're seeing a lot of value in the next quarter. So really, earlier when we were talking about having a demonstrable impact within 6 months is a completely realistic expectation.
Fair. So this one had actually come in during the presentation. I think you had brought it up on one of the challenge slides. But a big question, what's going on from a privacy side? Is it secure? Is it private? Can you operate within, whether it's the US or even European privacy laws?
That's a great question, Eric. I mean, we know various states in Europe have data privacy laws. A lot of it relates to personal information, or what's called PII. And the way that we address that with visual AI is typically with anonymization to strip all that data out of the reports that are collected. The AI solution can be configured to automatically identify any PII, be it a face, a name tag, a license plate, and automatically blur that. So any sort of evidence image or supporting image for an alert doesn't actually contain PII. So you don't have to worry about things like facial recognition or biometric identification information being captured in the system. And additionally, the solution does encrypt all the data, both in transit and in rest. So you don't have to worry about potential data security leaks. I mean, you've seen some of the logos of some of the companies that we work with today, and their IT departments definitely do give the solutions a lot of scrutiny and want to validate that the data is secure before they okay it being deployed in their industrial environment.
What infrastructure do you need? And do you need, special fancy AI cameras, or, can you use your iPhone? Like, what does it take?
So speaking from our perspective, Spark Cognition solution is compatible with pretty much any type of camera that's out there. Pretty much all modern IP cameras can produce what's called an RTSP stream, and we're able to connect to and process that specific stream. So you don't need a specific AI camera. You don't need a specific type of camera. You can typically use many of your existing cameras, which can be a big benefit, especially if you need specialized cameras for your deployment. Maybe you work in a hazardous area with an explosion risk, so you need an explosion resistant camera, or you need a camera that's got a high temperature rating because it's in a part of a critical process. So the solution can work with that. Our solution processing pipeline can work also with color cameras, black and white cameras, even infrared cameras out of the box. So if you have a camera that is in color mode during the daytime and infrared mode at night, because you don't have a lot of supplemental lighting at night, the solution will work with those. And lastly, about your comment about sort of iPhone or mobile cameras versus fixed cameras, because in these sorts of EHS applications, we're looking at generally continuous monitoring of the area, our solution is focused on working with fixed cameras. Obviously, if you think about it, if you don't monitor an area consistently, it's going to be hard to build up that representative view of those hazardous situations, near misses that are the base of that HSE pyramid. So that's why we really recommend and focus on working with fixed, classic out-of-the-box security cameras. I would say if you're going to install new cameras, we typically recommend people buy 4 megapixel or above. Cameras are so cheap these days, there aren't many that are less than that. But if you do have existing cameras that are lower resolution than that, typically we can work with them. Although the range on how far away from the camera you might be able to detect something may be a little bit reduced. But again, we can work with you to help you understand how far away you'll be able to detect activities.
With that, I want to thank everyone so much for the time. The moderators, excellent job. Really appreciate you hosting this. And I got to have a big thank you to everyone in the audience. You guys have busy schedules. Being able to take the time to do this, John, thanks for hopping on and entertaining me for an hour or so. Feel free to reach out directly. There'll be information out in the chats, and hope to work with you guys in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, before we wrap up today, we would like to share a resource with everyone from the folks at Spark Cognition. We'll drop that link in the chat for everyone, and you can click on that. That'll also be shared via our post-event email. We thank you all for attending this presentation, and we appreciate you taking the time to share your feedback via our post-event survey, which will pop up on a different screen after the webinar. A special thank you goes out to our presenters today, John Haslinger and Eric Schulte, and of course, all the team from our sponsor at Spark Cognition. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Take care, everyone, and have a safe day.